Thank you so much for joining us today on Connect and Collaborate, where we come together each day to introduce you to our network of business and community leaders and to discuss the important issues that impact business in Colorado and the region. I'm Tammy Schaefer, your on-air producer, and of course, one of those issues, a great impact on business, is education. And this week, we're focusing on secondary education, and our shows this week are sponsored by Talent Found. Talent Found connects students, job seekers, workers, and businesses with the programs, tools, and resources to design their own unique paths to career and business success. Find out more at talentfound.org. And today in our show, we're really fortunate to be talking with Rebecca Holmes. She's the president and CEO of Colorado Education Initiative. Rebecca, thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I really appreciate these wonderful in-depth conversations we're able to have about education this week. Tell us a little bit, starting off, tell us about Colorado Education Initiative.
Sure. So we were founded about 10 years ago to sit alongside the 178 school districts in Colorado and the Colorado Department of Education and to implement work that accelerates both improvement and innovation in K-12 across the state. So we do that in a bunch of ways. We roll up our sleeves and help school districts get some of their most important work from start to finish. We are known as an innovation thought leader, thinking about what's next in education. And then we really are a statewide convener, bringing together the voices of practitioners, business, policymakers, to help kind of elevate the dialogue about education and readiness for all of our kids.
Wonderful. So you're really getting a lot of the leaders, the thinkers, and the people together who, can help make the decisions and come up with your best ideas. So who do you work with most closely nationally or locally?
Sure. So we're really fortunate to work with who I consider to be some of the most innovative school leaders across the state. You'll have some great guests this week I saw that come out of the charter sector, and I spent time there too. But at CEI, we primarily work with traditional district superintendents and principals who are swimming upstream every day and against a system that wasn't necessarily built for innovation, but they're doing heroic work. And so we're fortunate to support, like I said, some of the most innovative school principals and school superintendents across the state.
So when you say, in a system that's not exactly built for change, right? And certainly not the change at the speed we're looking at right now. And we'll probably get into this more a little later, but a little bit of that perspective on how do you make change to such an old education system? Right? I mean, because it's really embedded. It's like you sit down, you read your books, you answer the questions, you practice, you spell, you do your arithmetic. What do we find has to change?
Yeah, so many things. So many of your listeners will have seen graphics or videos or commercials that show a phone 100 years ago and a phone today.
Right.
Mail service 100 years ago and delivery today. And then always it's juxtaposed with a picture of a classroom 100 years ago and a classroom today, and they look
much the same.
Frighteningly the same. So we are really focused on what does it look like to reinvent school systems in a way that they were built with the capacity to change and adapt. So to not get calcified in the way some of our systems are now, but to be built to be student-centered, to be built for equity, and to be built to be responsive to community needs. So that's pretty complex work. Most people don't sign up to say, yeah, blow up my school system and think totally differently, use my kids as guinea pigs.
Blow the doors off.
Right. So instead what we do is we help schools and districts pick work that, if done well, forces the system to sort of confront its most stale design elements. So for example, our school is built around an agrarian calendar.
Right.
I don't know about your family. My kids don't necessarily need the summer off to go work in an agrarian field anymore, right? And yet we still have that kind of calendar, that kind of use of time. We still have students moving through based on seat time. What's called the Carnegie unit, the idea that if you just sit in a class for 4 years and manage to pass, that is a proxy for mastery. And we know there's so many more modern and interesting ways to measure learning, to know if students are making progress, to have young people direct their learning themselves, to get out of that idea that the teacher is a font of knowledge at the front of the room when kids know they can Google, 90% of the answers.
Yeah.
And instead,
we used to covet the back of the book. or the back of the teacher's book, right? And now it's just like, oh, forget it, I'll just Google it.
Yeah.
And then they can have a reasonable debate with the teacher.
Right. And now what we need is young people that can be savvy consumers of those facts and know what's fact and what's not.
Oh, that's a great point.
Think about
there's
media.
So much information out there. How do you discern?
Exactly. So, like I said, we have heroic teachers and school leaders who are figuring this out, but they're doing it in a system that wasn't built for this era. And so our most exciting proof points are schools across the state who've really transformed themselves to look different, to be led differently, where teaching and learning looks radically different than it did even 10 years ago.
Great. So talking about that, what the past and present and what the future should look like, what is that current strategy? What are we focused on now in the next 3 to 5 years?
Yeah, so at CEI, Colorado Education Initiative, we have a couple of what we're calling big bets for the next 3 years, places where there isn't really a right answer yet, but we know there's a lot of momentum in the state. One of those is high school redesign. And it is, like I said, folks who are rolling up their sleeves and saying, I run a high school, I run a district that has 4, 6, 12 high schools, and we know we want this to look different. So they're in some learning networks with us, and they're taking first and second steps at reimagining what the high school experience could look like for the kids in their community.
Can you give us a hint?
Sure.
What does that look like? Yeah, how do you just shake up the classroom?
Yeah, so we have a hunch. So some people, some schools are using entry points like STEM as an example, right? So you can use a STEM platform to reinvent your high school. And what we think is important is you're not doing that because every kid is going to work in STEM.
Right.
But because STEM done well, science, technology, engineering, and math in the classroom, teaches kids to be problem solvers. It teaches them to respond to changes in technology. It teaches them to collaborate. So we're a little less interested in STEM for STEM's sake, although we know in this state in particular we need a lot of STEM literate graduates, but really more for what it teaches kids to do and how that will be applicable in all fields. It's not just STEM though. Some of our high schools are using industry certificates as a way to do that. Some are using civic competencies. They're reinventing high school largely around the idea that young people need to be informed contributors to their own community. And how do you teach them to be savvy communicators, familiar with politics, great consumers of media? So there's probably 5 or 6 entry points like that we're seeing people use in high school. One of the biggest challenges is all of us who are over 40 and our memory and our soft spot about what high school was supposed to be. Because pretty quickly these leaders run up against, I need to get rid of the way we use sports, or we can't, whatever you do, you can't get rid of your valedictorian or prom or your high school mascot. Those of us who have these cultural memories of what high school used to be sometimes get in the way because we're sort of reminiscent about the idea that high school had to look a certain way.
That's interesting because we feel in our time, right, those were milestones, or even if you looked back, in my generation, you could look back at the 50s or the 60s, your parents' generation, and they had prom and homecoming and I'm school mascot and stealing the other school's goat or whatever,
Exactly.
And yeah, so I can see where that'd be hard to shake off. I'm trying to imagine what it would look like.
Yeah. So some of our most interesting high schools in this state.
Is nostalgia important?
It has a role, right?
Yeah.
A dear friend of mine in this work says the hardest thing to kill is a high school mascot. That he was overseeing some work where he was merging 2 high schools because he had 2 very small high schools in his district, and it made a lot more sense to bring them together. And they couldn't get it done. Because really it was a fight over, I'm a 3rd generation lion and you're a 3rd generation,
eagle,
whatever it is, and you can't get rid of that. But we're seeing people do such interesting things, reusing time, helping young people really feel like high school is relevant again.
Yeah.
I talk to a lot of our highest performing kids across the state, and they tell me they know that they're just playing a game. That they've figured out the game of school. They know how to be good at school, but their most relevant learning comes from other places. And they will tell you first and foremost that spending 5 and 6 hours a day in a place that feels archaic, that doesn't, evolve for the way they use technology, for the careers they're interested in. They're sort of just playing a game in order to game the college admissions cycle. And so it's been really interesting to put those kids in the driver's seat and say to them, what would you want this high school experience to look like?
And I can see that because I remember in my time, I was very frustrated by the, your job as a student is to memorize this and regurgitate it on your test. And I wasn't good at memorizing. And I remember saying to one of my college professors, I'm like, you're going to have to teach me. You're going to have to teach me to know it, not to memorize it.
Right.
And he didn't like that.
Yeah.
But it matters, doesn't
Yeah.
it? You need to know how to apply the information, not just spill it back out on a test sheet.
Yeah, exactly. I think, many of us have childhood experiences that affect our careers. I'm more than 20 years in this work now, and I remember having a high school teacher, it was physics, and he said, bring your cheat sheet with all of those formulas into the test. Because
Right.
I don't care that you memorize them. I care that you know how to use them.
Exactly. Yeah, and I see my stepdaughter doing that with her chemistry right now, where her professor right now is like, bring the formulas in. Because my whole point of saying that, of my experience of memorizing or knowing, was today you can look it up.
Exactly.
And that was mine too. And I struggled with math, something, right? And in my Catholic school, the nuns were like, well, what are you going to do if you don't have a calculator? And today I'm like, look, I've got one right here. It's called my phone. But, we didn't know that. But you can look it up. You find the information you need. You need to know how to use the information.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The other thing we used to do that I've really changed after listening, from the mouths of babes to a
Right.
group of high school students. So we have a model that we base all our work on that has the 5 competencies we want all young people to have for the
Okay.
future. And this model was co-created by teachers and economists and industry leaders, and it has academic outcomes, and then it has these 4 other categories. And we used to refer to those as 21st century skills. And a few years ago, I was speaking to a group of high school students. Now, remember, it was 2015 at the time.
Okay.
And I was talking about the 21st century skills. And a young man in the back of the room raised his hand and said, Miss, I've only ever been educated in the 21st century. And you all talk about that as something you might get to when you're done teaching us our academic skills. This makes me very nervous. And we said, he's right. It's 2018. We've got to get rid of that title and be more explicit about what those other skills are that young people need. So we've worked with teachers across the state to build that out a little bit. And we talk about those other 4 competencies that young people need. How would you design a school that paid attention to all of those things?
Mm-hmm. And do me a favor, what are all those, it was 5 competencies?
Yeah. So academic, of course. Necessary but not sufficient, but nobody on our team will tell you that academic competencies don't still matter. That is absolutely still the business of school. The other 4, as we talk about them, are professional competencies, personal competencies, entrepreneurial competencies, which is my favorite, and civic competencies.
Right. So when earlier you mentioned those civic competencies, and you mentioned making them savvy communicators, learning where to get their information, what to trust in savvy communicators. Yeah. And that seems like a pretty reasonable challenge nowadays, where if their example is social media and everybody's communication strategy is like, no, you're wrong. And you're an idiot.
Yeah.
Right. So you've got a lot of work cut out for you.
We do. Now, interestingly, in Colorado, we don't mandate any curriculum at the state level. The only mandated curriculum in the state constitution under the education regulations is a course in civics. And this isn't in our work right now, but we're paying a lot of attention to people that are thinking about how do we update the way we teach civics in such a way that we remind young people how to have a civil debate with people who disagree with them.
Yes.
And in some days, I feel like that might be the most important thing we could figure out in K-12.
It very well could be. And then when you figure out how to teach that, go take it to Washington.
I start with the high school students. I think they're a little easier.
Well, they might be. So then you mentioned also the big bets. Your big bets for the Colorado Education Initiative, what that high school redesign is all about.
Yeah. So like I said, it's taking schools across the state who are interested in rethinking that experience and leading them through some short cycle innovation. It's really hard to reinvent an entire high school.
Sure.
But you can take small little hacks at things that you know as an educator have long been outdated. And the other thing we do is help them create networks. So this is pretty esoteric. It's hard to imagine the school of the future, but we network our school leaders with other schools that are a few steps further ahead in this. And so we've got some bright spots across the state and across the country, and it's so important to get people into a building that looks like this. We've all seen 50 years of what high school used to look like.
Right.
It's really important to shine a light on those bright spots where people are really starting to do this work on the ground.
Okay, and I can imagine there are some very talented teachers, educators out there that are trying new things or have seen where that old model doesn't work for them anymore, or coming up with the notions that will lead to this redesigned school.
Yeah. So you've hit on a real topic of passion for me. I started my career as a classroom teacher.
Right.
And I think a lot about the power of teachers to shape the young people that we need for our workforce, for our country. And
they're out there seeing what works.
They are.
And what doesn't.
Exactly. And on one hand, our teachers are kind of our greatest entrepreneurs because they're asked to do an actually just insane amount of things with no resources, and the best of them just figure it out. And at the same time, sometimes we have trained our teachers to be compliant. They've lived in a system that has rewarded their most compliant behavior. And we've seen a lot of teachers be pretty discouraged by that. So one of our big bets that's, I think, the most fun is it's called Space Lab. It has nothing to do with STEM, although we do work in the STEM field. Our Space Lab has nothing to do with sending people to space. It's about teaching teachers how to be innovators again. And so we, in our Space Lab, one of the things we do is teach teachers a unique blend of user-centered design and short cycle innovation and improvement science. Those are big, heady, edge-speak titles. But what it does is then we send them back into their classrooms and they're reminded of what it feels like to be an agent of change in their classroom and school. And they pick a project and they take a short cycle innovation, they take a hack at it, and they learn a bunch of stuff. And they come back and share with their peers what they learned. And it does great things in the schools, but what it really does is put teachers back in that innovator mindset, reminds them that they're entrepreneurial and that they have the ability to take some of these risks to try things that are new.
Wow, and I imagine there's a challenge in that too, as maybe parents see what's going on, and well, that's so different than my experience. Is that really what needs to be happening? So I imagine there's some pushback.
Exactly. It's probably not on accident that some of our most innovative schools are in parts of the state that have many of our most forward-thinking industries. Because you've got parents who work in an industry where it's firsthand to them, they see every day the way that traditional school based on a factory model isn't preparing them. Or didn't prepare them.
Right.
And so they want something different for their kid. It's really fertile ground in those communities.
Oh, that's a great point. You mentioned that factory model, and that's what the school, that public school education system was built to make an efficient running factory.
Exactly. That's why we had bells.
Age.
Exactly.
It is, isn't it? That's frightening.
I had a great mentor of this work remind me, if you meet someone who went to a very elite private boarding school, they never had bells.
Is that right?
Because those kids were going to be managers of the rest of us. So they didn't need to work on a bell schedule, right? But the traditional public school was built to have a 25% dropout rate. It was built to have a middle 50% who just moved along and got their basic skills. And then it was built to have 25% of kids who did really well. It's not surprising that 100 years later, despite lots of effort, we have roughly that same breakdown of success and non-success in our traditional system.
Tell me, what are you most excited about when it comes to high school redesign? What do you see as either a method that's going to break out and be the great way to do it, or just getting the teachers excited? Yeah,
there are a couple of things I'm the most excited about. One is a change in the relationship between educators and industry.
Okay,
so this used to be this tension. and this is not new. We're, I think over 100 years, there've probably been 5 or 6 different eras nationally where people have tried to make education more relevant for the workforce. But it's happening differently now. And we're really seeing educators and industry leaders as peers working on this together in a way that still honors the expertise of the educator, but says, you know what? Most of us as educators have only worked in education. And so we aren't the best people to create a curriculum around engineering or a curriculum around architecture. So really getting that partnership right is one of the most exciting things I think we're seeing. And the other is changing the relationship between a teacher and a student. Some people get nervous about this and think we're putting students in the driver's seat completely, and that's not what this means. When you see it done well, what you see is teachers that don't have to be the sage on the stage at the front of the room, but have figured out how to sort of be the guide on the side, if you will. Really setting up the framework for every student's learning and the guide rails for that, knowing what mastery looks like, but letting students have a bigger voice and more agency in designing the kind of learning that they want. The biggest thing that does is help students know, when have I really mastered something versus when do I need to keep working at it? And that's a lifelong skill that, especially in this economy where things are changing so rapidly, all of us need.
Interesting. I really like that idea of making the educator the guide that, and I want to say, because so many of the things that you mentioned, like teaching a student how to find information, what to do with that information to know whether it's the most reliable source, or has it been, is there a skew to how the story was told? Find the spin or whatever, right?
Yeah.
What's the concern if, you kind of mentioned that some people are a little leery about the idea of students having a little more autonomy there. What could go wrong?
I think what people worry about is that we're lowering the bar for rigor.
I see.
That if a student is deciding when they've achieved mastery, the tendency is to think kids will say, I'll take the easiest path through this work. And I would say 2 things to that. One is, we're not suggesting this is what should happen on every content area or in every grade level. This is when it's developmentally ready, mostly for secondary students. You can do it in some ways for elementary too. But that's the first, is there's some real guidelines on this to do it well. The second is that when kids are passionate about something, they'll set the bar for mastery much higher than we think. And when they're exposed to industry and they really understand what it looks like to take this thing that they're learning, that they're passionate about, and build work around it or build a career around it, they want to go farther often than their teachers think they need to. And when you've seen a few examples of a young person just running at something with that much passion and commitment, it's tough to go back to the high school model where they just earn the A- and get the 2 extra credit points and move on to the next subject
that
area.
class I was valedictorian.
Exactly.
Right? What does this change how, we have much more to talk about coming up in the next segment, but as we finish this one out, does that change what the classroom looks like?
In terms of physical layout, absolutely. So our office is actually a showroom for one of many of these sort of classroom furniture of the future companies. And it's so fun to think about what you really need to have a classroom be a collaborative workspace. You need modular furniture on wheels. You need all kinds of whiteboard space and projector space so that you're getting away from that idea of the teacher at the front of the room and kids in rows sitting passively. You even need to rethink the way that schools use their community. And so why are students in school? Does this have to be done in a school? Is there a community option that could make something more interesting?
Oh, that's fantastic. Really looking at the ways students learn and meeting them there a little bit. We are talking today with Rebecca Holmes, President and CEO of the Colorado Education Initiative. This is part of our series this week on secondary education, sponsored by Talent Found. We're so glad you're with us. Stay with us through the break, and we'll be right back. Thanks so much for staying with us today here on Connect and Collaborate. We're very excited to bring you a week-long focus on secondary education, and that our this week's shows is sponsored by Talent Found. Talent Found connects students, job seekers, workers, and businesses with the programs, tools, and resources to design their own unique paths to career and business success. Talent Found is championed by the Colorado Workforce Development Council and powered by Talent Found charter affiliates. You can find out more about them at talentfound.org. And today, I'm very pleased to be talking with Rebecca Holmes. She is president and CEO of Colorado Education Initiative. And, we spent last segment talking a bit about, high school redesign and really looking at, how do you more effectively teach students today without this pattern or model that we've been using for 50 years that maybe isn't as effective for today's learning.
Yeah.
Right. So tell me, as we were talking about high school redesign, tell me a little bit about personalized learning, competency-based personalized learning. What does that look like?
Yeah, so this is a big priority of ours at CEI for the next few years, and that's because we have some real bright spots in the state. The easiest way to explain competency-based learning is to talk about what it's not.
Okay.
And what it's not is what we're all really familiar with. The idea that everybody should start kindergarten when they're 5. That magic happens when you're 5 and you become kindergarten ready on August 1st. And what we know as parents is some kids are ready earlier and some kids are ready later. Well, that plays itself out all the way through our education system. Most of our high schools, for example, as I mentioned in the last segment, built on the Carnegie Unit, which was the idea that if you had enough hours sitting in a seat in a classroom and you didn't fail, that somehow that was a proxy for mastery of that content area and you moved on. And we know that most students somewhere in that, let's say, 10th grade algebra class or 9th grade algebra class have some holes. There's things they need to repeat. Some kids move faster, some kids move slower. But because really our schools were originally built around this factory cohort model, all kids start at the same place, they move on at the same time. That's what competency-based is meant to break up. It's the idea that we could build our schools around the fact that most kids move at a slightly different pace than the kid to the left and the kid to the right, and that you could design to have that be the norm instead of the exception.
And I'd like to point out, because my eyes kind of lit up at that point when you see, some kids move at different paces, and making that okay, that it's not this one failed or was held back or whatever, that there's some kind of shame involved with it. Right. Just mastery.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And some of us take longer to master some things and are faster at mastering others. Now, people get nervous that does this mean you're going to have a 8-year-old in 12th grade? And when we see people do this well, absolutely no. It does not mean that you're going to have an 8-year-old in 12th grade, because you're also taking into account emotional development and social development.
Because they might not excel in that area.
Exactly. But it means that a student who's mastering math doesn't have to sit there bored in their 8th grade math class, but the school could be designed so that it doesn't take a heroic family or a heroic teacher to move them ahead. You would just design for students to be able to move through at a more personalized pace.
Well, and that's what I can see that too. If your focus is on mastery, and maybe one student doesn't excel at math, but it doesn't, it's okay. There's not shame in it, because maybe they're really excelling in English and they've got a mastery program over there.
Right.
Languages, whatever.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
So it doesn't have to be everybody moving forward at the same time.
Right. When we explain what this is to industry leaders, they get it in a heartbeat, because it's pretty similar to the idea of a certificate program that you can demonstrate your mastery and move on when you can when you have your demonstration, and that you might have demonstrated one part of something and not the other part. And so, this happens in schools, but it happens because people are doing things for exceptional kids who are exceptional on one end of a spectrum.
And somebody's advocating for them.
Exactly. But what we're most interested in is places who are figuring out how you do this at the whole school level and then at the whole system level. So I always have to give a nod to our friends in Grand Junction. They will be, if they can get this right, one of the largest school districts in the country to redesign their whole system in a performance-based mastery way, where it's designed for students to be able to move at this more personalized pace with mastery and proficiency as the goal for every student.
And how did Grand Junction take the lead?
Yeah, so at CEI, we had a partnership with the Colorado Department of Education, and there was a little school in Lindsay, California, which is outside of Fresno, Central Valley, pretty rural and very low income, and they had done this at the school level, and it is a high school visit that I've been in hundreds of high schools in the last 20 years. This is the one I think of with the most positive memories. It was an incredible place.
Wow.
And we got a little bit of money, and we helped the Grand Junction School District, their board, their union rep, their superintendent, their community liaisons, fly out to Lindsay and take a look at what had happened there. Now, in Lindsay, it's a very small system. Grand Junction's pretty big. I believe it's the 7th biggest school district in our state.
Oh, okay.
So they're taking what happened in a very small system and figuring out how to do it at scale.
And was Grand Junction targeted for that? Because, well, it's still a good size, city area size of school, right? But is there something about it being more, not Denver that made it appealing?
They've taught me the term suburban rural. That's how they
Suburban
define
rural.
themselves.
Love it.
Because they've got, the Mesa School District covers a lot of geography, and they've got all different types. They've got some real rural schools, and they've got, Grand Junction, which is a pretty good sized city. And it really wasn't that. It was just a visionary school board and a visionary superintendent who said, we feel like we know that this helps us solve the needs of our kids. And we feel like we can take a leap to get this right.
And maybe even that mix of, like you said, suburban and rural, that it made more sense.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think
There.
that's part of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we have bright spots like that all across the state of people that are taking personalized learning, whether it's through grading policies, through kids being able to direct capstone projects to show their readiness to move on. Just some really exciting progress in this space.
So speaking of that, maybe Grand Junction being suburban rural versus what Denver looks like or different rural areas look like, what are the concerns between that urban versus rural or Denver versus the rest of the state?
Yeah. So we work statewide, and we're one of the few nonprofits in the education space that does that. So I think we have a good pulse on this. In some ways, the first thing we talk about is resources, that there are just a lot more resources in Denver and in the Front Range. But the flip side of that, what I'll tell you I've learned is that the nice thing about some of these smaller school systems is you get a visionary leader and a supportive board, and they can make magic in the course of 3 or 4 years.
They can move fast.
Yeah, it's not moving the Titanic like some of our large urban school districts have to do. They're really able to try some things, have one pilot school, and then in a few years have whatever this innovation is spread throughout their district.
How about that?
Yeah, it's great to see. There's some real bright spots across the state.
And then they become the model for the more cosmopolitan, metropolitan area.
Exactly, and that's one of the roles that we play at CEI. So I remember when I was leading a school, if I needed a problem solved, I often just called other principals that I trusted until I found the solution. Well, that's very inefficient, and that's unfortunately what a lot of our principals and superintendents find themselves doing. At CEI, we sometimes play that role of connective tissue to help our larger systems learn from our smaller systems, to help cross-pollinate our most innovative teachers and school principals and school superintendents so that they're in a network with each other entrepreneurial leaders and risk takers, really not having to recreate the wheel and learning what's working best in our schools.
Right, because if you're trying to start all this innovation from scratch, it's going to take you a really long time.
Exactly. And as people in industry know, R&D is really expensive, and we don't spend money on R&D in education.
Not in education.
Yeah.
You've got good enough luck spending the money on education.
Exactly.
Shifting gears a little bit, let's talk about school accountability in Colorado. Rebecca, we're talking with Rebecca Holmes. You've recently published an ed paper on school accountability. What do you want people to know about what's happening in Colorado?
Yeah, I get asked most frequently from people outside of education, why is it that our schools look the same as they did 100 years ago? What is impeding innovation? And sometimes it's things that we really once held as victories. And accountability is one of these. So when I first started in my classroom 20 years ago, there was no way to document and show the performance of my students in an inner city community as compared to the performance of a school in a more affluent community. And that was a problem. We needed, as taxpayers, we deserved to have transparency into that data. And so there was about a 15-year movement around accountability, and Colorado was a leader. So we have a pretty remarkable and fairly aligned and high-stakes accountability system for schools in our state. It does a lot of good things. But our point of view, and what we published in our blog last week, myself and my colleague, Dr. Asp, was that that system did a lot of good things, but it also had some unintended consequences. And one of them is that we put forward the idea that our commitment to accountability is actually impeding learning and risk-taking and innovation in our schools. That schools have been held now to such high-stakes standards based largely on point-in-time test scores of their students in math and English. Now, it's great because we honor growth, not just proficiency in that model, but that it's had some unintended consequences. Schools have taken out a lot of their untested subjects or moved their newer and less capable teachers into those subjects, that schools are less likely to take a risk on transformation because they worry about that accountability dip. You know, if in the first year or two my scores go down, I don't know if I'm willing to try this new thing.
So they're not able to be progressive because they've got to hit this mark.
Exactly. And that we've maybe ruined, or maybe not ruined, too strong of a word, but we've crowded out the space for continuous improvement. Leaders don't engage with that data, for the most part, in a way that helps them think, how do I help my school get better? They just are defensive around those results and say, oh, this feels like an autopsy, and you're just sort of telling me all the things that are wrong. So we've got, over the next 6 months, a series of additional blogs coming out where we're going to highlight some of the most high potential ideas for how we bring an innovator's mindset to our accountability system. And that's one of the things we think about a lot. Innovation isn't just about, the next silver bullet in the classroom, putting VR goggles on kids. It's really about bringing a new way of thinking to some of our most long-standing, vexing problems in education.
What do you see? You mentioned those challenges have been, because you need to have this high-performing school, so you're not willing to take risk to try something new that might make it high-performing. So you are kind of stuck in a catch-22.
Yeah.
What do you see? What do you see happening when educators feel some freedom to take those risks?
Well, if you've trained them in a few things, right? You don't just want creativity for teachers for the sake of, but if you've trained them how to do short cycle innovation, if you've trained them how to collect data and quickly measure success or failure, if you've trained them how to be comfortable with failure so that we actually learn from it, the things we see educators do are very inspiring. I've mentioned a few districts, but in particular the St. Vrain School District, which is about an hour north of Denver. You see a whole crop of teachers who've been trained in design thinking, and they approach every problem with that kind of design mindset in their classroom.
What is design thinking?
Oh, this comes out of the way we do it. It comes out of the Stanford Design School and IDEO, and it's the idea that we often don't put users at the center when we're trying to solve a problem. So when we train teachers how to do this, the first thing they do is they go do deep empathy research. So they put students or families or whoever's problem they're trying to solve at the center, and they interview, and they listen, and they try to leave their own bias at the door, and they really ground their problem solving in their users and not themselves. So what we want is student-centered classrooms built around young people, not around the needs of adults. And this is a pretty powerful way to switch up the way we solve problems in education.
Wow. Any other great examples of that? St. Vrain's a good example, like you said.
Yeah, absolutely. There's some great examples happening at schools in Denver, and then we just received about $1 million grant to work specifically with a district in Colorado Springs, D11. And I could go on. There are more examples than this, but these are just a few.
Right.
In D11, we're really trying to figure out how do you get innovation to scale and to spread across a school district. So they've got remarkable things happening in classrooms across their district, but it hasn't gone system-wide yet. So this $1 million grant from a national funder is going to help us help them figure out how do you take great practices to scale so that you don't have one school that's a little oasis, a little island of excellence, but that you have innovation as a mindset through your whole system.
Right, and I can see that because, and I'm going to use charter schools as an example, that when you get one of these schools that has some great innovation going on and some great concepts, then it's a struggle to, how do I get my kid in?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, you've
And
got
so-
300 kid waiting lists at some of those schools, and we don't want to have one great school. We
Yes.
want great schools across the state. The other thing, I've spent my career split both in the charter system
Yes.
and the more traditional system, if you will, although we don't love that title. And I think transformation is hard. It took all I had to build a school from scratch. But the thing I've learned is much tougher is taking an existing school and trying to transform it while you're still flying that plane every day.
Sure.
So our system leaders in district systems who have to do that, who have to transform a school, need to have great, easy ways to learn from our most innovative models and from our charters and our other schools across the state.
And what does that look like? Does that look like having educators get together and bounce these ideas off each other, or share what works best?
We do that in a few ways. We have a lot of networks, so we put people in networks to learn from each other in facilitated ways. We run some things called Seeing is Believing tours, where we take folks who are interested in seeing one particular idea in practice and put them in a community and in a facilitated way do these tours where they're not just touring a school and saying, well, that was great, but these guys have more money, or that was great, but they're a charter, I don't have those autonomies. Really instead digging in as practitioners to learn from each other. And then increasingly, we're looking at ways to use video and online learning to speed this up a little bit. But ultimately, education's a human endeavor, and we all kind of need to be in each other's buildings to do our best learning.
Right. And so you mentioned, having schools. You've got some great innovative schools, but it can't be just one per district, or however that works per city. So how do you manage that equity? You have, and this is maybe going on to a different topic, it seems like a lot of your work centers on equal access for all kids. How do you I'll just elaborate on that.
Yeah, so I've spent a long time, the majority of my career, thinking about equity in education. And in Colorado, that means some pretty unique things. It means not only how do we well serve low-income kids and kids of color and English language learners, but it also is a lot about our disparities between rural and urban. And particularly some of the places in Colorado where we haven't made enough headway for special education students. So equity in our work means a lot of things.
Okay.
But I think one of the ways we think about it the most at CEI is that often as educators, when we see a gap, we see kids that aren't performing, we're trained to think about the kid as the problem. How do I bring these kids' scores up?
Okay.
The way we've shaped it at CEI is really different. It's about the fact that the system was sort of designed, like I said, to not serve 25% of its kids. And so we shouldn't be surprised that we're doing that. What does it look like instead to design a school, to design a system for all students to have equal access to the future that they want? And this is new work. We don't have a lot of great places in the state to point to that have figured it out yet, but we've got some really good leaders working on the right conversations about how we change the paradigm of who performs well and who does school well in the K through 12 system. Education really is our best shot at evening that playing field for all of our kids.
And I know you mentioned a school in California that they took as a model for Grand Junction. I imagine you're looking at other states, other best practices throughout the country. What do you find inspiring?
Oh, yeah. There's so many places that are inspiring. I think what we're most interested in is where it's spread beyond one school, whether that's through a network of schools or through a third party like ourselves that's helping take practices in one community and bring them to another. The other thing that's inspiring to us is, like I said, how we're changing what it means to be a teacher. You can't pay attention to education in Colorado right now and not be worried about the teacher shortage. And I think there are many reasons we have a teacher shortage. One of them is certainly pay. But the other is that we've, I think, communicated all the worst parts of the job, and we forgot to remind people, forgot to tell them that This is a job where you can be innovative. You are entrepreneurial. You're helping
Now
kids
you
solve
not
problems.
only should be, you need to be.
Exactly. It's worrying to think that we need our young people to be innovative problem solvers, but we haven't encouraged that in our own teachers. Our model talks a lot about the entrepreneurial mindset that we want all kids to have. It's equally important to make sure that our teachers know that teaching is a place where entrepreneurial thinking is welcome and necessary.
That's such a great point, and I'm debating whether I should go a little bit off track here. But I have a friend who recently became a principal, and I could try to remember the name of the school, but I won't. But one example was, I think it was the first year she was principal there. They every year, I think it was like a fall festival where they would set up like booths and games and everything like that. And she said, "How about this year? The students create the games and set up the booths." And so they had to learn to nail some boards together, or how are you going to make this wheel spin, or, to really give them and I thought that was brilliant to just flip that model a little bit and give them this, whatever hands-on experience. How are you going to run the odds on this game? Or, what do the contestants have to do to win?
Yeah.
Just thinking that rather than being the recipient of it.
Right. And in 20 years, when you ask those kids, what do you most remember? What was the most salient, interesting thing you did in your K-12 experience? That will be what they point to. When we ask each other that, I run into people that are hesitant about, school transformation, school worked just fine for me. But then you ask, what's your strongest memory, strongest positive learning memory?
Sure.
It's almost always something outside the classroom. Or it's that one unusual project that really creative teacher let you do. Or it's the time you were in charge of your science fair project and it didn't work out, right? Most adults really do remember something that came from one of those innovative moments when a teacher didn't have to avoid risk, and they were willing to let students be at the center and let them fail.
Yeah. Great ideas. We are talking with Rebecca Holmes. She's president and CEO of the Colorado Education Initiative, and we're so glad to have her as part of the conversation on secondary education, our focus this week, sponsored by Talent Found. Rebecca, we've talked so much of so many great innovations and high school redesign, so many different just really innovative ideas and kind of flipping school on its head in a way, right?
Yeah.
What do you see coming that we should all get ready for?
There's one thing we've been thinking a lot about, because we do some work in the STEM space, science, technology, engineering, and math. And we are part of a few initiatives really trying to advance how much AP computer science is taken, advanced placement computer science is taken in the state, and how many students are ready to have coding as their second or third language.
Oh.
Now, this feels like important work, and it is. What worries me the most is when I told a friend of mine who works in some of the most advanced artificial intelligence work I know of, she said, I know schools are working on this, but you're already 10 years too late.
Oh, wow.
And we really stepped back and said, oh, man, what do we learn about that? And she gave us great advice, and so did the industry she worked in. She said, keep going at it. Every kid does need to know how to do some basic coding in the future. And at the same time, don't lose sight of civics and communication and collaboration, because at the end of the day, AI will probably beat us on all the things related to coding, and it'll be the things that make us most human that keep us competitive.
Sure.
So that's been really keeping me up at night. How do we make sure that young people in every school in Colorado and across the country have this interesting mix of coding and tech experience, but that we don't lose sight of teamwork, collaboration, communication, civic engagement, so that we're also excellent humans?
Right. We want excellent students, but excellent humans is the goal, isn't it? Thank you so much, Rebecca, for this great conversation. And I just want to just expand on that, like you said, that communication, the collaboration, understanding the civics, getting these kids the tools to, like you said, be really excellent humans. I don't know. It just, and as I was reaching back on the civics there, you think of, because if you don't have that collaboration and that communication and the understanding of the civics and how society works, you end up with, now I can't remember the name of it. Oh, shoot. The book where they're on the island and the... Darn it, I lost it. Oh, but thank you so much, Rebecca, for this great conversation. We really appreciate your work with the Colorado Education Initiative, and thank you for being on our show today.
Thank you.